In the autumn of 1887, across the bone-dry plains of Dakota Territory, the sound of an axe was the season's true anthem. It rang sharp and clear in the thin air, a rhythm of survival beaten out by men preparing for the long white siege of winter. In the small, hopeful settlement of Prairie Ridge, nestled in a shallow dip in the endless grass sea, this sound was everywhere. Men worked with a grim urgency, felling the last of the cottonwoods along the creek, splitting and stacking the precious fuel that meant the difference between life and a frozen, silent death. They checked the chinking on their cabins, forcing a mixture of mud, straw, and manure into the gaps between the logs, a defense against the coming cold that was as traditional as it was, ultimately, inadequate. Among them, one man's labor produced a different sound and a different sight altogether. His name was Lars Eriksson, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived 2 years prior with little more than a set of well-oiled tools and a quiet, almost unnerving patience. While his neighbors reinforced their single-walled log homes, Lars was engaged in an act of baffling construction. He was building a second, flimsy-looking wall around his entire cabin. Using cheap, scavenged lumber, thin pickets, and second-rate planks the local mill owner had practically given away, he erected a simple frame that stood about 14 inches away from his sturdy log walls. It looked less like a fortification and more like a crude fence built far too close to the house it was meant to protect. Day after day, he hammered and sawed, slowly encasing his home in this strange, seemingly useless wooden shell. The community watched, first with curiosity, then with open mockery. They were practical people, forged by hardship, and they saw only waste. Waste of wood, however poor its quality. Waste of time that could be better spent cutting more fuel. Waste of effort that would surely be smashed to splinters by the first serious winter gale. Silas Blackwood, a man whose family had been in the territory for a decade and who considered himself the settlement's voice of reason, was the most vocal critic. He would stand with his arms crossed, a chunk of chewing tobacco working in his jaw, and pronounce judgment for all to hear. "That's a fence around a house," he declared one afternoon, spitting for emphasis. "Going to trap the snow right up against his logs. It'll rot them out by spring." Others chimed in, their laughter carried on the wind. They called it Eriksson's folly. They called it a wooden sweater. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. But within 6 months, the laughter would freeze in their throats, a storm of unprecedented fury, a meteorological anomaly that would enter the annals of history as the schoolhouse blizzard, the children's blizzard of 1888, was gathering its strength in the north. It would descend upon the plains with the speed of an express train, a solid wall of white that would drop the temperature by 100 degrees in a single day and bury the world in a screaming vortex of ice and wind. In the heart of that storm, every decision made that autumn would be tested. The standard time-honored cabins would become ice-lined tombs, their stoves devouring fuel to no effect. And inside Lars Eriksson's strange, double-walled home, a quiet, life-saving secret would be revealed. The foolish shelter would become the only truly safe place for miles. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about the unforgiving physics of cold, of convection, and of the immense thermal power of still air that everyone else on that windswept prairie dismissed as foolish nonsense? Lars Eriksson had been born to the cold. He came from the high valleys of Norway, a land where winter was not a season, but a dominant, shaping force of life itself. His memory was a tapestry woven with the textures of survival in a harsh climate. He remembered the feel of thick wool, the scent of burning birch, and the profound, muffling silence that fell after a heavy snow. Most importantly, he remembered the architecture of his home village. The houses were not built like the tall, proud cabins of the American frontier, which seemed to his eyes to be designed to impress rather than to protect. The homes of his youth were low and solid, often banked with earth on their northern faces, presenting a humble profile to the wind. They were built with a deep, intuitive understanding of heat and its elusive nature. His grandfather, a shipwright who understood the properties of wood better than any man Lars had ever known, had once explained their home's construction to him as a boy. He had knocked on the thick inner wall. "This is the house," he had said in his gruff Norwegian. Then he led the boy outside and knocked on the outer planking. "And this is the coat. The house wears a coat just like you do. What keeps you warm is not the wool itself, but the air trapped in the wool." The idea had lodged itself deep in Lars's mind, the sweater of air. It was this principle that he saw violated everywhere in the New World. The Dakota cabins were built with a single layer. They had no coat. They stood naked to the wind, relying on the sheer mass of their logs, a strategy that was woefully inefficient. A thick log wall might slow the cold, but it could not stop it. His conviction was hardened by experience. Before staking his claim in Dakota, he had spent a winter working in Minneapolis, cutting ice from the frozen lakes. He had marveled at the construction of the ice houses, vast barns designed to keep their frozen harvest solid through the heat of summer. Their secret was identical to his grandfather's wisdom: double walls. 2 layers of planking, separated by a gap of up to 2 feet, packed tightly with sawdust. The sawdust did not generate cold. It simply trapped millions of tiny pockets of air, preventing the summer heat from moving through the walls. If sawdust and still air could defeat a Minnesota summer, Lars reasoned, it could surely defeat a Dakota winter. He also observed the local Lakota people. He saw how their winter teepees, the conical dwellings so often dismissed by settlers as primitive, were in fact sophisticated thermal structures. They used an inner liner of hide or canvas, creating an air gap that insulated the living space and directed drafts up and out through the smoke hole. One day, he shared a bit of tobacco with an old Lakota man who was watching him work. The man, through a mixture of gestures and broken English, explained something profound. He pointed to the north, the direction of the winter wind. He spoke of how the bison turned to face the storm, their dense fur creating a shield. He then drew in the dirt, showing how a low, angled drift of snow could be a blanket, not an enemy. The wind, he explained, would flow over a low obstacle, piling the snow behind it, creating a natural insulation bank. This conversation solidified Lars's plan. His outer wall would not just hold insulation, it would manage the wind and the snow. What Lars Ericsson was grappling with were the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, principles that would not be formally codified by building scientists for another half-century, but which he understood with a craftsman's intuitive genius. He knew that heat moves in 3 ways. The first is conduction, the flow of heat through a solid material. A cast iron pan on a stove gets hot through conduction. The thick logs of his neighbors' cabins were conductors. Heat from their stoves flowed directly through the solid wood and into the frigid air outside. It was a constant, losing battle. The second is radiation, the movement of heat in the form of infrared waves. A person standing near a fire feels its warmth through radiation. In a cabin, the warm stove, the people, every object radiates heat, and this energy travels outward, striking the cold walls and being lost. The third and most relentless enemy in a Dakota winter was convection. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of a fluid, like air or water. The settlers understood this in its most obvious form, the draft. A blast of cold air slicing through a crack in the wall was a convective current. But the process was also more subtle and far more pervasive. Air, when heated, expands, becomes less dense, and rises. When it touches a cold surface, like a window or a poorly insulated wall, it cools, becomes denser, and sinks. This creates a constant, invisible loop of air within a room, a miniature weather system that endlessly circulates, delivering warmth to the cold surfaces where it can be lost. This is why a person could feel a chill even in a room with a roaring fire. Their own body heat was being stripped away by these imperceptible currents. Lars's entire design was a declaration of war on convection and conduction. His weapon was simple: dead air. Air itself is a remarkably poor conductor of heat. Its molecules are too far apart to transfer thermal energy efficiently, but this is only true if the air is still. If it is allowed to move, to convect, it becomes a powerful engine of heat loss. Lars's 14-inch cavity, packed with sawdust, dried moss, and cattail fluff, was not just a container for insulation. It was a device for creating millions of tiny pockets of air, each one trapped, unable to move, unable to form a convective loop. He was building a barrier not of wood or moss, but of stillness itself. In modern terms, he was dramatically increasing his home's R-value, its resistance to heat flow. While his neighbor's log walls had an R-value of perhaps 8, Lars was building a composite wall system that would approach an R-value of 30 or more. He was building a fortress, and its walls were made of air. The construction of Ericsson's Folly became the settlement's primary form of autumn entertainment. Lars began by acquiring his materials, a process that only deepened his neighbor's scorn. He did not purchase the fine, straight-grained planks that Silas Blackwood used to build a new porch. Instead, he made a deal with the sawyer at the small steam-powered mill down by the creek. For a few dollars and the promise of repairing the mill's troublesome leather belting, he was allowed to haul away wagon loads of slab wood, the rounded outer cuts of logs, and piles of sawdust. To the settlers, sawdust was a nuisance, a fire hazard to be dumped in the creek or burned. To Lars, it was gold. He spent weeks hauling it, piling it under a makeshift lean-to to keep it perfectly dry. He also gathered other materials that provoked ridicule. He was seen walking the marshy edges of the creek, harvesting cattails whose fluffy seed heads he dried in the sun. He collected bags of dry moss from the shaded northern faces of the few rocky outcrops in the area. These were not the materials of a serious builder. They were the gleanings of a pauper. His technique was methodical and precise. He first bolted heavy ledger blocks to the exterior of his existing log cabin, about a foot from the top and a foot from the bottom. These would support the frame for his outer wall. He then built the frame itself, a simple grid of 2x4s, creating a box that stood exactly 14 inches away from the logs on all sides. He did not sheath the entire outside at once. Instead, he worked in sections, a few feet at a time. He would nail up a few rows of the cheap, thin planking on the inside of his new frame, creating a trough. Into this trough, he carefully packed his insulating mixture of sawdust, moss, and cattail fluff. He didn't just dump it in. He tamped it down gently with a long pole, ensuring it was dense enough to prevent settling, but not so compressed that it would lose its airy structure. Once a section was filled to his satisfaction, he would nail the exterior planks over it, sealing the insulation in. It was a slow, painstaking process. He paid obsessive attention to the details. Around his two small windows, he built extended jambs, creating deep, tunnel-like sills that were also packed with insulation. This would combat the thermal bridging, the process by which cold could travel through solid framing members, a detail no one else even considered. His most peculiar modification, however, was inside the cabin. One week, he spent 3 days building a new, lower ceiling. The original cabin had a vaulted ceiling that peaked at nearly 12 feet, a feature Silas Blackwood often boasted about in his own home. "A man needs a high ceiling for the air to be good," Blackwood would pontificate. Lars, however, strung new joists across the room at a height of just under 7 feet. He laid rough planks over them, creating a new, low attic space. Over the next week, he hauled bucket after bucket of his insulating mix up a ladder and spread it a foot thick across the new attic floor. He was deliberately shrinking his living space, an act that seemed utterly backward to his neighbors. Finally, he built what looked like a small, crude shack around his front door. It was a 6-foot by 6-foot enclosure with its own outer door. To enter Lars's cabin, one now had to pass through 2 doors. It was an airlock, a buffer zone to prevent a rush of cold air from flooding the house every time the door was opened. It also served as a convenient, sheltered place to store a day's worth of firewood, keeping it dry and close at hand. Silas Blackwood could no longer contain himself. He strode over to Lars's property one crisp October afternoon, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. Lars was on a ladder, meticulously fitting the final piece of exterior sheathing near the roofline. "Erickson," Blackwood called up, his voice heavy with condescending authority. "I've held my tongue, but I can't watch this foolishness any longer. What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Lars looked down, his pale blue eyes calm. He did not seem offended. He simply waited. "You're boxing yourself in like a coffin," Blackwood continued, gesturing at the low ceiling joists visible through the open doorway. "All that good air will go sour by January. And this porch," he kicked at the small enclosure. "It's a fire trap waiting to happen. You're inviting the snow to bury your own front door." He shook his head, a picture of pragmatic certainty. "There's only one way to beat a Dakota winter, and that's with a good stove and a big wood pile. Just cut more wood, Erickson. That's the Dakota way. The land provides the fuel. You just have to have the spine to go and get it." This was the core of their disagreement. Blackwood believed in a strategy of overwhelming force, of endlessly feeding the fire to combat the cold. His was a philosophy of production. Lars slowly descended the ladder. He wiped his hands on his trousers and faced the larger man. He did not argue. He did not defend his choices in any grand way. He looked at his own creation, the strange, thick-walled box he had built. He thought of his grandfather, of the ice houses, of the bison facing the storm. He knew that Blackwood's strategy was an exhausting, inefficient war of attrition against the laws of physics, a war that, in a truly great storm, a man could not win. Blackwood expected a debate, perhaps a heated defense. Instead, Lars offered a quiet, 2-word rebuttal that was, in its own way, a complete explanation of his entire philosophy. He looked at Silas Blackwood, offered a small, polite nod, and said simply, "Less fire." Then he turned and went back to his work, leaving the settlement's self-appointed expert standing alone, utterly baffled and more convinced than ever of the Norwegian's madness. Lars continued his methodical work, ignoring the whispers and the stares. He trusted his hands, his memory, and the silent, immutable laws of the cold. His preparations were not just for a winter, but for the winter, and it was coming. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned with a treacherous lie. The air was unnaturally warm for midwinter, a balmy thaw that drew people out of their homes without their heavy coats. The sky was an overcast slate-gray canvas, but the wind was gentle. Children, released from their cabins by the mild weather, made their way to the small one-room schoolhouse, their lunch pails swinging. Farmers took the opportunity to move livestock or make a quick trip to the settlement's small general store. It felt like a reprieve, a gift from a winter that had thus far been relatively mild. But in the Arctic North, a colossal mass of frigid air had broken free and was now hurtling south across the open prairie with terrifying, silent speed. It was not a conventional storm front that could be seen approaching for hours. It was a sudden, violent displacement of the entire atmosphere. At around 11 in the morning, the lie was exposed. The change was breathtakingly abrupt. The temperature, which had hovered just above freezing, plummeted as if a switch had been thrown. In a matter of minutes, it dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. The wind, which had been a soft breeze, erupted into a shrieking horizontal gale of over 60 miles per hour, and with it came the snow. It was not a gentle flurry, but a blinding, opaque blizzard, the flakes so fine and hard they felt like sandblasting ice crystals. The world vanished. Visibility dropped to zero. A man could not see his own hand in front of his face. The sun was obliterated. The very concept of direction ceased to exist. The air itself became a thick, white, roaring chaos. This was the storm that would be named for the children caught in it, many of whom would wander lost and freeze to death just yards from the safety of their own homes. The siege had begun. Inside Silas Blackwood's cabin, the reality of his flawed philosophy became immediately and terrifyingly apparent. His home, which had felt so spacious and sturdy just an hour before, was transformed into a sieve. The wind, a living entity, hammered at the log walls. It forced its way through the chinking he had so proudly repaired, blasting jets of supercooled air and fine, powdery snow into the room. A fine white dust began to coat every surface on the north wall. The single-plank door, a symbol of rustic strength, was now his greatest vulnerability. A thick, glass-like layer of frost bloomed on its interior surface, growing visibly thicker by the minute. His wife, Mary, tore strips from an old blanket and desperately tried to stuff them into the cracks around the door and window frames, but it was a futile gesture. For every crack she plugged, the wind found 10 more. The stove, a large cast-iron box stove that was Blackwood's pride, became a ravenous, insatiable beast. He fed it split oak and cottonwood, stuffing it full until its sides glowed a dull, menacing red. The heat it produced was immense, but it was also useless. It blasted out into the room, rose immediately to the high, 12-foot ceiling he had boasted about, and then was sucked away by the endless convective currents created by the cold walls. The vast space above their heads, which he had called good air, was now a thermal liability, a giant reservoir of cold that actively worked against them. Standing 6 feet from the stove, they felt its scorching radiation on their faces, while their backs remained numb with a penetrating chill. Their son, a small boy of 5 named Thomas, began to cry, a thin, whimpering sound that was nearly lost in the howl of the wind. They wrapped him in every blanket they owned, but the cold was relentless. It was inside with them. The firewood he had stacked so neatly just outside the door was now a useless, buried treasure. A massive drift, sculpted by the wind flowing around the house, had already buried the woodpile under 6 feet of densely packed snow. When Silas, in a fit of panic, tried to open the door to get more, the wind tore it from his grasp and slammed it back, flooding the room with a tidal wave of white fury. It took all his strength to force it shut and drop the heavy bar. They were trapped. Their fuel was inaccessible. The battle was already lost. Less than 100 yards away, inside Lars Eriksson's cabin, the world was entirely different. The first and most striking sensation was the quiet. The 60-mile-per-hour gale, which shrieked and howled like a banshee outside the Blackwood home, was reduced to a deep, distant roar. The outer wall, the flimsy-looking fence of scavenged planks, was taking the full, kinetic force of the wind. It vibrated and hummed with the storm's energy, acting as a baffle, a windbreak that dissipated the gale's primary assault. The 14 inches of space between the walls meant that the log structure of the house itself was not being directly hammered by the wind. The snow, just as the old Lakota man had predicted, was not a threat, but an ally. The wind swirled around the structure, depositing deep, insulating drifts against the outer walls, effectively burying the house in a blanket of natural insulation. By nightfall, Lars's home would be a man-made snow cave. Inside, the atmosphere was one of profound and surreal calm. The air was still. There were no drafts, no jets of infiltrating snow. The inner log walls, buffered from the extreme cold by the thick layer of insulated dead air, were only slightly cool to the touch, not coated in a sheath of ice. Lars's stove, a much smaller and more efficient model than Blackwood's, burned with a low, steady, almost lazy flame. He had to add a small log only once every hour. The heat it produced was not immediately stolen. It radiated gently into the room, warming the air, the floors, the furniture, creating a stable, comfortable thermal environment. The low 7-foot ceiling that Blackwood had mocked as a coffin lid now proved to be one of the design's most brilliant features. It kept the warm air down in the living space, where it was needed, preventing the formation of a useless reservoir of heat near the roof. The air did not feel stale or sour. A small, well-designed flue vent provided adequate controlled ventilation without creating a draft. Their living space was a small, warm bubble of safety, perfectly protected from the elemental chaos raging just inches away. His entire system was performing exactly as he had calculated. It was a triumph of physics over brute force. As the storm raged into its 10th hour, Lars Eriksson began to document his victory. This was not an act of pride, but of scientific confirmation. He was a man who trusted data. He had with him a precious and rare object on the frontier, an accurate mercury thermometer, a gift from his brother, an engineer in Oslo. He hung it from a ceiling joist in the center of the room. It registered a steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He then briefly opened the inner door and held the thermometer in the small, unheated space of his airlock porch. The temperature there was 20 degrees. He recorded these numbers in a small ledger with a piece of charcoal. Outside, he knew, The ambient temperature was now 40 degrees below zero, and the wind chill was a life-extinguishing 75 below. His double wall system was successfully maintaining a temperature differential of over 100 degrees. He documented his fuel consumption, making a small mark in the ledger for each log he placed in the stove. His neatly stacked pile of wood, stored securely in the airlock porch, was barely diminished. He had enough to last for a week, perhaps longer. He then lit a candle and performed his final test. He moved slowly around the room, holding the flame near the edges of the windows and the frame of the inner door. He held it near the floorboards. The flame stood perfectly erect, a tall, unwavering spear of light. It did not dance, it did not bend, it did not even flicker. There were no drafts. The house was sealed. It was a perfect static system. His wife, Anna, sat calmly knitting, the click of her needles a peaceful counterpoint to the distant roar of the wind. The schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Vance, who boarded with the Ericksons, watched him with wide, astonished eyes, realizing she was witnessing not just an act of survival, but a quiet, profound demonstration of genius. Just after midnight, a new sound fought its way through the storm's howl. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the outer door of the airlock. It was not the sound of a casual visitor. It was the sound of pure terror. Lars took down his lantern, unbarred the inner door, and stepped into the relative cold of the porch. The pounding came again, weaker this time. He wrestled with the outer door, the snow already piled high against it, and finally managed to pull it inward. A figure collapsed into the small space, a ghost made of snow and ice. It was Silas Blackwood. His face was a mask of frozen agony, his beard a solid block of ice. He was not wearing a proper coat. "Help," he croaked, the word a painful rasp from a frozen throat. "Mary, the boy, the fire is out." He had burned through his meager indoor supply of wood, then a chair, then the small kitchen table. Now there was nothing. The temperature in his cabin was plummeting to match the Arctic fury outside. Lars acted without hesitation and without a single word of reproach. There was no time for, "I told you so." There was only time for action. He helped Blackwood inside to the warmth of the main room, handing him to the care of his wife and Miss Vance. He then pulled on his heaviest coat and boots. He took a long coil of rope from a peg, tied one end securely to the iron hinge of his inner door, and handed the other end to the shivering Blackwood. "Hold this," he commanded. He stepped out into the maelstrom, the rope playing out behind him, a lifeline in the blinding chaos. He fought his way through the waist-deep snow, leaning into a wind so powerful it threatened to lift him off his feet. He could not see. He could only feel the pull of the rope and the memory of the direction to Blackwood's cabin. He found it, a dark, silent shape against the roaring white. Inside was a scene of utter despair. Mary Blackwood was huddled in a corner with her son, both wrapped in a single, frost-covered quilt. The boy's lips were blue. The air was lethally cold. Lars worked quickly, bundling the mother and child in more blankets he had carried with him. He guided them out into the storm, back along the rope, a slow, desperate procession from a house of failure to a house of quiet, warm success. When Silas Blackwood stumbled back into the Erickson cabin behind his family, the contrast struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not a blast of overpowering heat that greeted him, but a deep, pervasive, and utterly still warmth. The air did not move. It was calm. It was safe. He watched as Anna Erickson gently removed the frozen outer layers from his son, wrapped him in a warm woolen blanket, and gave him a cup of warm broth. Within minutes, the color began to return to the boy's cheeks. The blue tinge around his lips faded. Silas looked around the small, low-ceilinged room. He saw the gently burning stove, the unwavering flame of the lantern. He saw the calm on every face. His own home, a monument to frontier common sense, had become a death trap. This place, this folly, was an ark. He walked over to the north wall, the one that had been coated with ice in his own home. He placed his palm flat against the logs. It was barely cool. He was a proud man, a man whose opinion carried weight. But in that moment, all his certainty, all his conventional wisdom lay shattered around him. He turned to the quiet Norwegian, his voice now stripped of all its bluster and filled only with a humbled, desperate need to understand. He did not apologize. The situation was beyond apologies. Instead, he asked a quiet, technical question, the first step in his painful education. "The space," he said, his voice cracking. "The space between the walls. What did you fill it with?" Lars Eriksson looked at the broken man, the rival whose mockery had been the soundtrack to his autumn's labor. He felt no triumph, no smug satisfaction. His vindication was not in Blackwood's defeat, but in the soft, regular breathing of the sleeping child by the stove. He answered the question with the simple grace of a man sharing essential truth. "Sawdust," he replied, "and dry moss. Anything that holds the air still. The air is the true wall." He then ladled a bowl of hot stew and handed it to Silas. The lesson had been delivered, not by a lecture, but by the undeniable reality of survival. In the warm, quiet stillness of the small cabin, surrounded by the storm's impotent rage, the student was finally ready to listen to the master. When the great blizzard finally broke 2 days later, revealing a world transformed, a silent, white landscape of immense drifts and sculpted snow, the story of the rescue spread through the stunned and grieving settlement like a slow thaw. The community had suffered. 2 homesteaders on the edge of the settlement were found frozen in their barn. Many others had suffered terrible frostbite and lost livestock. Every single family had a harrowing tale of fighting the cold, of burning furniture, of huddling together in the dark. And in the middle of this landscape of shared trauma, there was the story of the Eriksson cabin, the quiet, warm house where 3 families had waited out the storm in perfect safety and relative comfort. Silas Blackwood, humbled and forever changed by the experience, became Lars's most fervent advocate. The man who had coined the term Eriksson's folly now spoke of the Norwegian's wisdom with the zeal of a convert. He was the first to formally ask for instruction. One clear, cold afternoon, a group of men gathered outside Lars's home. They stood quietly, hats in hand, their earlier mockery replaced by a deep and urgent respect. Lars, uncomfortable as the center of attention, simply did what a good craftsman does. He showed them his work. Using a piece of charcoal on the smooth face of a split log, he drew the cross-section of his wall. He sketched the 2 layers, the insulating gap, the ledger blocks. He explained the importance of keeping the fill material perfectly dry. He drew the lowered ceiling and explained how it kept the heat from escaping. He detailed the construction of the airlock porch, what he called a vinterstue, a winter room. He answered their questions not with complex theories, but with simple, practical rules. "The wind is your enemy," he told them, "but the snow can be your friend. Let it bury the house. It is a good blanket." That spring, a new sound was heard across Prairie Ridge. It was the sound of renovation. a flurry of construction began, unlike any seen before. Guided by Lars, and with Silas Blackwood now serving as an enthusiastic foreman, families began retrofitting their homes. They built their own versions of the Dakota sweater, as it was now affectionately known. Lacking access to sawdust, some used chopped straw or prairie hay. One family, living near the creek, packed their walls with the thick, fibrous sod they cut from the banks. The materials varied, but the principle, Lars's principle of creating an insulated cavity of still air, was the same. They lowered their ceilings. They built small, sturdy airlock porches. The settlement, which had been a collection of individual, vulnerable cabins, was transforming itself, hardening its shell against the next winter. The results were immediate and profound. The following winter, while still harsh, was met with a newfound confidence. The most tangible benefit was the dramatic reduction in fuel consumption. Families that had once required 10 cords of wood to survive the winter now found that 4 or 5 were ample. The back-breaking labor of cutting and hauling wood was nearly cut in half. But the true measure of success was written in the settlement's ledger of life and death. The local doctor, who rode a circuit through 3 counties, noted a stark decline in cases of pneumonia and other respiratory ailments in Prairie Ridge. In previous winters, it was common to lose several infants and elderly residents to the relentless cold. That winter, and for the winters that followed, they survived. The constant penetrating chill that had weakened the vulnerable was gone, replaced by a stable, healthy warmth. Lars Eriksson's innovation had not just made his neighbors more comfortable, it had fundamentally altered the demography of their survival. The quiet wisdom of a single immigrant had become the community's shared shield. The legacy of the Dakota sweater did not remain confined to the small settlement of Prairie Ridge. Miss Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher who had witnessed the storm from the safety of the Eriksson cabin, was a meticulous correspondent. In the spring of 1888, she wrote a long, detailed letter to her brother, an architectural engineer in Chicago. She described the blizzard's fury, the failure of the conventional cabins, and, with intricate drawings based on Lars's charcoal sketches, the design and performance of his double-walled home. Intrigued, her brother saw past the rustic materials and recognized the sophisticated thermal principles at play. He rewrote his sister's account into a formal article titled Principles of Thermal Efficiency in Prairie Construction, and submitted it to an influential agricultural journal. The article, published that autumn, was a quiet sensation. It was reprinted in farmers' almanacs and bulletins distributed by the territorial government. The idea of the insulated cavity wall, born of Norwegian tradition and frontier necessity, began to spread across the Great Plains. Settlers from Nebraska to Montana began building their homes with Eriksson walling, a testament to a wisdom that had been proven in the crucible of one of history's most terrifying storms. The principles that Lars Eriksson demonstrated with sawdust, moss, and scrap lumber are the very same principles that underpin modern building science. What he called still air, we now quantify with a precise metric, the R value, a measure of a material's resistance to heat flow. His simple wooden planks and packed sawdust created a high-performance thermal break, a concept now essential in energy-efficient construction, to prevent thermal bridging through studs and joists. His airlock porch is the direct ancestor of the modern Arctic entry, or mudroom, a critical feature in cold climate design. His lowered ceiling concentrated warmth in the occupied zone, a strategy now known as conditioning a smaller thermal envelope. With the simple tools at his disposal, Lars Ericsson had created, by instinct and by memory, a buffered, super-insulated home, a structure that would be perfectly at home in the pages of a modern green building manual. He understood, in a way his contemporaries did not, that a building is not a static object, but a dynamic system, constantly interacting with the energy of the environment around it. The story of Ericsson's folly is more than just a historical account of a clever innovation. It is a parable about the nature of wisdom itself. It highlights the conflict between arrogant, entrenched convention and quiet, observant competence. The settlers of Prairie Ridge believed they knew the way of the land, but their approach was one of brute force, of fighting nature head-on. Lars Ericsson, drawing from generations of accumulated knowledge, chose a different path. He did not seek to defeat the winter, but to understand and neutralize its power. His story is a powerful testament to the value of practical knowledge, of listening to the wisdom of elders, and of having the courage to trust one's own careful calculations, even in the face of universal mockery. It is a reminder that the most profound solutions are often not about adding more power, but about conserving what you already have. On the vast, windswept plains of North America, where the winters still howl with the same elemental fury, the loudest lessons were never shouted in the heart of the gale. They were whispered, then and now, in the profound and life-giving stillness of a well-built wall.